No pressure, no pressure now after that introduction. Um, I always start out a workshop or a talk similar to this with the same thing I'm going to say tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are. And that's if you work the program differently than I do, or you look at this step or anything I'm going to be talking about differently than I do, don't worry about it. It doesn't make me right and you wrong. All I share is my experience and what's worked for me. If you do it differently and you're getting good results, keep doing what you're doing. If you're having problems staying sober, one, or two, you're, because I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes anyway about what I call untreated alcoholism, which is being sober, but suffering from things like resentments, fear, anxiety, depression, things like that. And you can't seem to figure a way out of it. Maybe try some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'm a bit of an anomaly, I think, in Alcoholics Anonymous, in that I've never gotten away from the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've liked it from day one. My sobriety date is September 21st, 1976. So in about a month, I'll be sober 45 years. And I've always been active in Alcoholics Anonymous. I am not a high bottom guy by any stretch of the imagination. I came here because I couldn't stop drinking. I had tried over and over and over on my own to stop drinking. And I know my subject is supposed to be the 11th step, and it's going to be the 11th step. I promise you that. But when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had never said a prayer in my life. I didn't believe in anything. So I want to start at what got me here and what led me to what I do and believe today. As I said, I couldn't stop drinking. I had tried hundreds and hundreds of times on my own to get sober. I would come out of drunks over and over and over. And I was a drunk that had hangovers. So if I was at home, I'd just crawl off into the bathroom on my hands and knees, and then I'd be sick. And then I would stand up and I'd hold on to the sink and I would look in my own eyes. And if I heaved that morning, I threw up so violently, there'd be tears coming down my face. And I'd look in my own eyes and I'd tell myself, I'll never do this again. I'll never be this sick. I'll never be this hungover. If I was in trouble, I'd say, I'll never be in this much trouble again. And I meant it. I meant it with everything I had. And by the end of the day, or no later than the following day, I'm drunk again. And I don't understand how that happens to me over and over and over. And on September 21st of that year, now I was a daily drunk, okay? So day after day after day before the morning of September 22nd of that year, I would tell myself I'll never do it again. But when I came off that last drunk, I remember saying to me, and I remember it like it was yesterday, I remember saying to me, I can't stop. I'm going to be drunk again today, and I don't want to be drunk again today. And I wasn't in any trouble on that last drunk. I mean, you know, it's just the realization that I couldn't stop drinking. And there were mornings that I was in a lot of trouble. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was unemployed. I was unemployable. I'd been that way for a year and a half. I had hair down to here. I had a long beard. I was dirty. I remember a few months before I got sober, my wife went downstairs. We lived in this apartment. She went downstairs and somebody had stolen her car. She comes up and wakes me out of a drunk. And she says, somebody stole my car. So I get on the phone. We lived in Pasadena, California, and I get on the phone. I call the Pasadena Police Department. I start screaming at this female officer that answered the phone. Last night, while those damn cops were in a donut shop eating donuts on my taxpayer dollars, which I hadn't paid in years, by the way, but my taxpayer dollars from years earlier, somebody came in the garage and they stole my wife's car. And what are you going to do about it? And this lady says, hold on, Mr. Dobin. And she comes back about 3 minutes later, and now her voice is just syrupy sweet. She says, no, Mr. Dobin, your car wasn't stolen. It was repossessed last night for non-payment. Now, I always say, if I'm talking at a large meeting, you talk to a group, we have 200 people here, 209 people. I guarantee you there's other people here that have had cars repossessed. But if you're young, don't do this one, because this is not a relationship builder. About a month after that, we got a knock on the door, and these two big guys came in and they repossessed her refrigerator. And let me tell you, that is not easy to do. One. And two, the reason I will say, if you're young and you're getting into a relationship, don't do that. 2 weeks ago, we celebrated 51 years of marriage. Now, when we get into a fight, I clap for her, not me. Let me tell you, I'm serious. I'm dead serious. When I talk about where I came from, and then also the untreated alcoholism, you'll realize why I clap for her, not me. But I will tell you, if you're young, 51 years later, we get into a fight, and about half the time she brings up that stupid refrigerator. So don't do that. That is not a good thing. So anyway, I come into Alcoholics Anonymous and I crawl in here desperate for sobriety, but I liked AA. I liked AA. And I got involved. I started going to about 7 meetings a week, an average. A bad week might be 5, a good week might be 10. I got a sponsor right away. At about 10 months sober, I worked the steps. Okay. I'm in service to Alcoholics Anonymous from 3 days of sobriety until today. I've never gotten away from meetings, 44 plus years. I've never gone a week without a meeting. I'm about as involved as could be. But in the beginning, my sobriety, let me talk about where I come from as far as God, because this is an 11-step meeting. I had never said a prayer in my life. Now, I wasn't an atheist. I was just I didn't grow up in a religious household. Okay. It wasn't something that was discussed. What was discussed was pull yourself up by the bootstraps, work harder. You can achieve if you just work hard enough. So I come into Alcoholics Anonymous and people start talking about a higher power and all of that. And I don't believe anything. Okay. I'm just not a believer, but I'm sober for about 2 months and I'm at a meeting, and it was a subject came up in that meeting of turning your will and life over to the care of God. And this was the start for me. Okay. A guy in the back of the room raised his hand, and because people were talking about having a problem doing that. It was a question and answer type of meeting. And he said, when I was new, he said, I had a lot of problems with that. And he said, one day I'm having lunch with a guy at the local Alano club we had. And the guy asked me, he said, Richard, he said, tell me about this God you're having all these problems with. And Richard said, okay, I sure will. He said, one, because he came from a very religious background, different than I did. But he said, number one, when I die, he said, I got 100,000 years in purgatory in front of me. And he watched me do this and he's going to get even with me. And he watched me do that and he's going to get even with me. And the guy looked at him and he said, you know what, Richard? He said, if I thought that's what God was, he said, I not only wouldn't turn my will and life over to him, he said, I wouldn't even turn my back on him. He said, why don't you go home tonight, take out a piece of paper, make a list of maybe half a dozen things that if these qualities God had, you could trust him. Bring it back to me tomorrow and we'll talk. And Richard said, okay, I'll do that. And he went home and made a list of about a half a dozen things. He brings it back to the guy the next day. And the guy says, start praying to that, see what happens. And then Richard said these magic words. He said, and I'm sober 11 years. And I went, wow, I could do that. And I like the number 12 because of 12 steps. I didn't know there were traditions and concepts. I just knew the steps at 2 months. But I said, okay, I'll make a list of 12 things that are important to me. And that was my start. That was my start. Now it's grown a lot, as you'll hear. okay? But we start wherever we start. I've sponsored 2 guys on this program that were priests or are priests, okay? They have a lot more knowledge. They started at a different place than I started. It doesn't matter. As long as we make, in my opinion, as long as we make a start and keep continuing. My message in Alcoholics Anonymous, if you ever heard me anywhere else, is the same as it'll be tonight. Continuous work on the steps, continuous spiritual growth. Why? Because as active as I was in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was active during the first 4 years of my sobriety, I probably averaged 7 meetings a week. As I said, bad week 5, good week 10, average about 7. I'm in service, went through all 12 steps at 10 months sober, wrote the inventory, did some amends, all of that, went through the whole thing. And yet at 4 years of sobriety, now I'm not talking about physically, okay? I stopped drinking physically, I got better. I'm not talking about materially, because I had a tough sponsor that told me to go back to work. He said, you have responsibilities. You have a wife, you have an infant daughter, you need to go to work. And he made me go back to work. So materially, I started to do better. In fact, much better. I bought my wife stuff to try to make up for the bad behavior. Good stuff, stuff like cars and houses. Houses are good stuff, right? So I'm trying. But at 4 years sober, what I found, and I find this wherever I go in Alcoholics Anonymous, people that like me, that are like I was, suffering from what I call untreated alcoholism, where even though I'm sober, going to 7 meetings a week, emotionally, I'm the same man sober I was drunk. And I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why, because for me, now I'm not talking for anyone else here, just for me, but for me, as well as being an alcoholic, I'm the type of guy that wants to sound good, that wants to be respected. So what, and I'm a copycat. Now, I know there are people that are alcoholic enders. Like you hear it all the time. I'm an alcoholic and an addict. Well, I'm an alcoholic and a copycat. So I've been at meetings with Calvin. He's got a good message. So I go to a meeting and Calvin's there and I'm listening to what he has to say, because the next meeting I'm copying it. I don't know what it means, how to do it or anything else, but I sound good in the meetings. But the meeting ends and I walk out of the door and I'm right back in the same world I lived. Right back. If this happened once, it happened 100 times. I go home. I get in a fight about something. Something's wrong because I bought her the house. She's not keeping it clean. So I either say something, think something, or give her the look. You guys know what the look is. I go storming out of the house. As I pull my car into the parking lot, I put my AA smile on because I'm sober 4 years, slap everybody on the back, tell them how great stuff is, sit in the meeting, get called on in the meeting, copy Calvin, what he said yesterday, I say. Meeting ends, hold the people's hands, say the Lord's Prayer, drive home and get right back in the same fight I left 2 hours earlier. And I don't understand that. Emotionally, I'm having anxiety attacks where I feel like I'm jumping out of my skin. I'm arguing in my head with my boss all the time or other people I'm working with. I got the type of mind, by the time I'm out of the shower in the morning, I've already been in 3 arguments in my head with people I need to straighten out during the day. And I don't understand it. I don't understand what's going on. I try to do better and I'm not. And I can't get past it. Because if I tell people, like I go to a meeting and I'll say, boy, I got in another fight with Ann. What should I do? Go to more meetings, man. Meeting makers make it. Well, I'll tell you, now, this again, just my opinion, but blame Ali if you don't like this one. Meeting makers make meetings. That's what they make. Now you're talking to a guy who goes to a lot of meetings. I think they're important. I think they're important. But the answer is the steps. The answer is an application of steps. I'm 4 years sober. This is what, 40 years ago, almost 41 years ago. I hit a bottom that was 100 times worse than the one I hit drinking. And I am far from a high. You don't come here unemployed for a year and a half, unable to stop drinking, burned up every relationship you have, and think, oh, I'm a high bottom guy. I'm not. But the one I hit drinking or sober was 100 times worse. And I go to a meeting and I hear a guy share about what I've been talking about for the last 5 minutes or so. He called it untreated alcoholism. But then he flipped the coin over and he said he found a way to live in Alcoholics Anonymous through an application of 12 steps. Not what he did yesterday, what he's doing today, where he was able to treat his family okay. When he looked in the mirror, he liked what he saw. And I went up to him and I asked him for help. And he invited me to his place of business the next day. And I showed up 8:30. I stayed with him all day. He became my sponsor. He was my sponsor for 17 years. He said, Ron, the answer is in the steps. I said, I did the steps, Bob. I did them when I was sober 10 months. Did all of them. The inventory, the whole thing. He said, no, Ron, not what you've done. He said, it's an application of 12 steps. It's what are you doing today? He said, my job as a sponsor is to take you through the steps and show you how to take them out of the book, off the wall, and apply them in your life. So when dinner's not on the table, you don't go in a rat race in your brain thinking, boy, she don't love me anymore or something like that. You know, or something's going wrong at work. He said, I'll show you how to apply this stuff. That's the message that I bring. Through the steps, we find a way to live comfortably and we find a relationship with the God of our understanding. I told you where I started. I made up a God. Now, Bob comes into my life. He starts talking to me about practicing the presence of God. I didn't take a look at, it's funny. I went inside and I got my little clock. So I made sure I stopped at 40 minutes, but not that bright, I guess. I didn't look at what time I started. What time am I supposed to quit?
I'll give you a 5-minute warning. You're good.
Okay. About how much longer do I have?
20 minutes, 25
Good
minutes.
enough. Okay. So Barb starts talking to me about practicing the presence of God. I said, what do you mean practice the presence of God? He said, Ron, practice of presence, all that means is what you think about all day long. I said, okay. I said, what do you think I think about all day long? He said, well, I've been your sponsor for a while. He said, I can tell you exactly what you think about most of the day. I said, what? He said, you think about resentments, fears, and I'll get even for old hurts. You rehearse things that have happened to you in your life and how you're going to get a different outcome this time. I said, man, you're right. That's exactly what I think about all the time. He said, instead of that, try to form a relationship with God. I said, what do you mean form a relationship? He said, well, if we got up from here and we decided we were going to drive to a meeting, he said, would you talk to me in the car? I said, of course. He said, well, how about talking to God during the day? I said, that makes sense. I said, but I forget to do that all the time. My mind goes back to the old hurt. My mind goes back to when my parents got divorced and said, you're the man of the house and all of that stuff. My mind goes back to when this happened or that happened, or I'm afraid of this. What am I going to do? So I don't remember God. He said, start to practice the presence. I said, well, how do I do that? He said, I started. Now, my sponsor was a mechanic at that time. He said, I started with a Zippo lighter. He said, I used to smoke. He said, I kept a Zippo lighter up here in my breast pocket. So if I went to light a cigarette, I touched that Zippo lighter, I would talk to God. He said, if I bend over to get a tool or something, the Zippo lighter would fall out. When I touch it, I would talk to God. Now, by that time, I had stopped smoking. But I thought, now I'm a sales guy. I get in and out of my car probably 30, 40, 50 times a day. I said, okay, every time I touch the car door, I'll talk to God. And that was my beginning to form a relationship. On my wrist, I wear an Apple Watch. You know why? Because I set it to beep every hour. The only reason I set it to beep every hour is left to my devices. I forget to talk to God. I get too busy in my head. So that was the beginning for me. Start to talk to God. All right. When Bob passed away, I was 22 years sober. I got another sponsor I had met along the way, a guy that lived in Chicago by the name of Paul Martin. Great guy, great speaker. So Paul becomes my sponsor. And he says to me, as we're talking, he had the same message Bob did, repeated work on the steps. But he said to me, Ron, he said, the 11th step talks about prayer and meditation. He said, I understand what you're talking about practicing the presence of God and praying all the time. He said, but how much time do you spend in meditation? I said, well, I don't meditate. I've never done it. I don't know how to do it or anything else. I said, but I pray all the time. I'm really good at that, right? You know how you give your sponsor your resume when you want to impress them. So he says to me, he said, you said you were sober how long now? I said, 22 years. He thinks for about 20 seconds. And he says, you know, with 22 years of sobriety, he said, you should be meditating 3 hours a day. I said, are you crazy, Paul? I said, I work, man. I said, I got a responsible job. I said, I'm married. I got 2 kids. I go to a lot of meetings. I sponsor a lot of guys. I said, I don't have time to meditate 3 hours a day. So we start negotiating, right? I get him down to 5 minutes. I remember thinking to myself at the end of that conversation, I ought to quit what I'm doing. I was a financial advisor. I was thinking I ought to quit what I'm doing and become a professional negotiator. I mean, 3 hours to 5 minutes. But at Paul's 60th birthday, he had a big AA thing, 60 years. Paul was good friends with Bill and Lois Wilson. His sponsor was a guy named Tom Powers, who was the ghostwriter of the 12 and 12 and AA Comes of Age. So Paul knew his stuff, okay? At his 60th AA birthday party, I showed up at it, right? And I meet all these other guys that he had sponsored from all over the country. All of us flew in for this thing because he was really important in our lives. And I'm talking to all of these guys from all over them. And they said, and every one of them, well, what did he say to you about the meditation? He would just look at somebody. He'd look at Wayne there or Michael and say, Michael, how long are you sober? I'm sober 10 years. You should be meditating 9 hours a day. And then you get him down to 5 minutes. Everybody got him down to 5 minutes. He just wanted you to make a beginning. Wanted you to make a beginning. And that was the beginning for me. I started to read a lot about prayer and meditation. I started to become more of a seeker of a better relationship with God. Okay, one of the books I read is Journey to Awakening by a guy named Ram Dass. If you've never heard of Ram Dass, this will help you to like him. Ram Dass was a professor. His given name was Richard Alpert. Richard Alpert was a professor at Harvard. And for the younger people, you won't know this, but for us older folks, we do. He was the professor along with Timothy Leary that got fired from Harvard for taking LSD. And he went over to India, became Ram Dass, and he was a spiritual teacher for many next 40, 50 years. He wrote a book on meditation. I've read many books on meditation, from breathing meditation to sense meditation to passage meditation, etc. I've become a seeker to the best of my ability to have a better relationship with God. The thing that when Ali asked me to pick a couple of sentences from here, I read just about every morning, page 85 from the start. It is easy to let up on our this spiritual program of action. I read this on page 86, and I'll skip the first part on retire at night. Now, I personally do that in the morning, okay? Have I kept something to myself, et cetera, et cetera. And then the paragraph I picked. On awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. I consider my plans for the day. Okay, now when I read, I'll just pass this along. It's something that I do. I read it a little differently, as you're going to hear, than what's in the big book. Okay, and all I mean by what's different, I read it all in the singular. So where it says we, I say I. And I read it all in the present tense rather than the past tense. It's just a lot stronger for me doing it that way. So on awakening, I think about the 24 hours ahead of me, okay? I consider my plans for the day. Before I begin, I ask God to direct my thinking, especially asking that it be divorced from self-pity, dishonest, or self-seeking motives. Under these conditions, I can employ my mental faculties with assurance. For after all, God gave me brains to use. My thought life will be placed on a much higher plane when my thinking is cleared of wrong motives. Now, here's the part that I gave Tally. In thinking about my day, I may face indecision. Anybody ever have that during the day? Not sure what to do. Okay. I may not be able to determine a course to take. Here I ask God. Now, I had to find this out with a lot of years of sobriety. But any time that Bill puts the word ask in the big book, he's instructing us to do three things. One is to pray. What am I asking him for? The second is to meditate, but not like a breathing meditation. If you look up the word meditation in a 1930s dictionary, you'll find that what Bill meant by meditate back then was think about what I'm asking God to do. Vision, and then the third is visualize. What would that look like? So here I ask, I pray, I think about what it is I'm asking God, and I visualize what would that look like when I'm asking God for an inspiration, an intuitive thought, or a decision. I relax, I take it easy. I don't struggle. I'm often surprised how the right answers come after I've tried this for a while. What used to be my hunch or an occasional inspiration gradually becomes a working part of my mind. Being still inexperienced and having just made conscious contact with God, it is not probable that I'm going to be inspired at all times. I might pay for this presumption in all sorts of absurd actions and ideas. Nevertheless, I find that my thinking will, as time passes, be more and more on the plane of inspiration. I come to rely on it. That's my truth. That's what's happened. In the last year and a half, and I'm not a newcomer in Alcoholics Anonymous, I have made more growth in this area because of one thing. About 10 years ago, and the one thing I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of my time is something that they did in the early days. If you're a historian in Alcoholics Anonymous, you will find from 1935 through 1939, all of the early members, be it Bill, Bob, or any of the early members, did their prayer and meditation, their quiet time, through what the Oxford groups used to do. About 10 years ago, a friend of mine gave me a pamphlet on what the Oxford groups used to do. And I kind of glanced at it, and you know how sometimes you get something, you go, that's cool, and it's filed, it's in my case. About a year and a half ago, I heard of a workshop on something called two-way prayer, which is what they did in the Oxford groups. And I said, I'm going to try that. And so I went to the workshop, put on by a guy by the name of Father Bill W. I like Bill W. I think that's a cool name, a guy in Houston. And I went to it. And he's a historian in alcoholics. We've become very close because I grew up in Rockaway Beach, New York, and so did he. And he's a couple of years ahead of me in sobriety. So he's become my spiritual advisor in fact, what's today? Tuesday? We're gonna talk for another hour and a half Thursday of this week. But he put on this workshop on two-way prayer. And part of that workshop was an exercise. We're not going to do it tonight, but I'll go through what I do in this. But a workshop on how to do it. And then people started to share what they got out of it. And that's normally what I do in these workshops. And I listened to what the people had to share, and it became something that I incorporated in my program. Now, Bill hid this in the big book, and you'll see this when you see what I'm reading, and it's why I picked what I picked, Ali, so you know there was a little sneaky there on me. But it says, in thinking about my day, I may face indecision. I may not be able to determine a course to take. Here I ask God for an inspiration, an intuitive thought or decision. So what do I do with this two-way prayer? I write to God every single day what's on my heart. Might be, how do I get closer to you? How do I have more of a belief? It might be something a year last September 30th to be exact. My youngest daughter was about 6.5, 7 months pregnant. And she called, she said, Dad, would you or Mom come and pick up Hannah, her older, so at that time, 5-year-old, have her stay with you. I've got to go to the hospital. So I met him over at the hospital. It was about 9:10 at night. And said, what's going on? And she said, oh, I've got some pains. The doctors say I just need a shot. I should be home, but let Hannah stay with you. We'll pick her, I'll have Dan pick her up in the morning. We got a call about an hour later. Our third grandchild was born a few months premature. I had no idea whether she was going to live or die. Now, that's pretty hairy stuff. I wrote to God about it. That was my two-way prayer. God, little Maddie was born 2 months premature. Everything we're reading about it and everything Michelle is saying, we don't know if she'll make it through the night. Now, this daughter had had a stroke 5 years earlier. I didn't know if she'd be able to take the loss of her child or her husband or my wife. I'm a total idiot, and I know it, a know-it-all, push, shove, bull in the china cabinet type of guy. And they didn't need that. That's for sure. I could go find the book that this prayer is in. If I knew I don't ever rehearse what I'm going to talk about in these things. Otherwise, I'd be a lot more prepared. It's just whatever comes out. But I wrote to God. What came back to me? Get on the internet, research preemies and the success rate of preemies. That kid today is a little over 9 months old, and she's doing great. She is absolutely doing great. Okay. Don't be the tough guy, know-it-all. Listen for their concerns. Be there for the rest of your family members. I followed those directions. For the last, year and a half, I don't think I've missed 5 days in a year and a half of two-way prayer. And I'm going to tell you, I'm a guy that from 4 years sober, when I met Bob, to today, has done nothing but try to increase my spirituality, my application of 12 steps. How do I write more searching inventories? How do I take whatever step it is at a deeper level? But through this two-way prayer and through doing it, I would strongly suggest there's a website, twowayprayer.org. Get on it. Find one, a workshop. It's not, it is AA. It's what we did in the early days. And I will tell you, it has been a literal game changer for me as far as my relationship with God. And in my relationship with God, I was sober, almost 43 plus years. Okay, when I ran into it. So I wasn't at ground zero anymore. But it has increased to a trust and a faith that I couldn't get on my own. I'll close with a story, and it kind of explains this trust and faith. And it's a story of, since your meeting takes place in Canada, and we were to Toronto for the international and went to Niagara Falls. And a lot of people may have heard this story of the tightrope walker that stretches the tightrope across Niagara Falls. And he's got a huge ego. And he says, Sunday, I'm going to walk across my tightrope. You guys are going to see exactly what I do. I'm the greatest aerialist there's ever been. And there's a big crowd, and he walks across and walks back, and the wind's blowing and the tightrope's going like this. And they applaud, and he says, that's a applause, but not for somebody as great as I am. And he says, okay, watch this. And he does the same thing, but he walks across and he walks back on his hands. And they're applauding even louder. But he says, that's still not enough. Still not enough. And there's a wheelbarrow over there, and there's bunches of sand. And he takes a wheelbarrow and he puts sand in it. And he walks across real slowly, and the tightrope's going like this and going like this. And he gets back across, and the people are going just nuts. He screams at them. He says, am I the greatest aerialist you ever saw? And they're all, yes, we've never seen anybody do that. And there's this one little guy in the front, and he looks at that guy and he says, do you think I'm the greatest aerialist in the world? And the guy says, you are the greatest. I've never seen anything like it. He said, all right, get in the wheelbarrow. We're walking across together. And you know what that man said to him? He said, hell no, I'm not getting in that wheelbarrow. Well, how many times do we do that with God? Through prayer, meditation, and trying to become a seeker to the best of my ability. I won't say all the time. There's sometimes I say, hell no, I'm not getting in that wheelbarrow. But most of the time, I'm willing to jump in and trust the process. And it came because of an application of steps in people like you. So, Ali, thanks for asking me to do this. I hope somebody got something out of what I said.